Hello, and welcome to What is Innovation, the podcast that explores the reality of a word in danger of losing its meaning altogether. I'm your host, Jared Simmons, and I'm thrilled to be joined by Nick Jain. Nick is the CEO of IdeaScale, an innovation software company that helps major organizations such as Comcast and state and federal governments innovate faster and better. Nick graduated at the top of his class from Harvard Business School and holds a theoretical mathematics and physics degree from Dartmouth. Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
This is going to be great. All right, let's dive right in. What, to your mind, is innovation?
Innovation, to me, is a process for which you either develop new things that you can do or better ways to do existing things that you were already doing.
Got it. So new or better.
And I want to emphasize the word, it's a process, which I want to distinguish from it being an event, an action, or a specific invention, for example. Innovation is a process for how you do things new, how you do new things, or you do old things better.
That's so important. Innovation as a process and not an event. In kind of drawing that clear distinction, which I also think is important, what have you seen that makes you feel like it's important to help people understand that it's not an event?
So I'll use a recent example. Everyone's getting excited about generative AI and large language models, right? I'm a mathematician and I run a tech company. So those things are, things we love and nerd out about a ton.
Yeah.
But innovation for large language models and Gen AI is not that we could create a chatbot. Innovation was a process of a whole bunch of things that happened over the last 20 or 30 years. So there was some really complex linear algebra that went into the math. And I think 2017, a bunch of guys at Google and University of Toronto published a paper in an academic journal, which immediately caught fire because they figured out a way how to cut the computation time in half. And then at the same time, over the last 5 or 10 years, just imagine how much cloud computing has grown where, you used to, 30 years ago, you needed a supercomputer in your university's basement. Today, you can go to Amazon or Azure or Google and pay them pennies for unimaginable amounts of computing power. So innovation was not chatbots and LLMs. We actually knew how to do that 50, 60 years ago. The innovation was all these tiny incremental things that have compounded together over the last 10 or 20 years. The hard technology of cloud computing, some cool mathematics, a paper from a bunch of guys at Google and University of Toronto. All of a sudden, we now have a process that's enabled some really, really cool things that are revolutionizing the world as we see it.
Oh, man, that is so true. And such a great and important point, because as people outside of the industry, we only see the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. But what I hear you saying is that innovation is not the outcome. It's the process to arriving at that outcome.
Yeah. I love ChatGPT and Claude and the competitors, so I'm not knocking on them, but They're not the innovation, right? The innovation was all the stuff. They're just the outcome of that really cool set of innovative processes.
Interesting. So if I think about the process that you sort of laid out, if we look at the chatbot aspect of things, go back 50, 60 years, as you said, that process, no one was governing the process to get to where we are now. No one entity was saying, all right, this is what we're going to do. In 1965, we're going to create chatbots. That'll give us ChatGPT-4 in 2023. You know what I mean? So help me understand, when you talk about a process, I think a lot of people will think, oh, I need to create a process. I need to manage a process. I need to organize it. What's the role of an organic process? How can you take advantage of sort of the organic type of process that delivered where we are today?
Sure. So the way I would describe it at an organization's level is you want to create a set of circumstances and incentives that enable innovation to happen. And a really good example of this is the university system, right? Where you give a bunch of professors tenure, you give them some amount of funding and say, go create cool stuff, right? Especially in the sciences, a lot of these scientists are researching really minuscule things that won't be useful for 60, 70 years, right? Like a lot of the stuff Einstein won the Nobel Prize for in the 1920s wasn't actually practically useful for 70, 80 years.
Yeah.
Right. And then all of a sudden in the 90s, GPS came around and GPS was like super, super useful, right? Imagine living your life today without having GPS.
Right.
But that's based on some stuff some general relativity stuff Einstein came up with in the 1920s because the university system created a culture where innovation was encouraged and created the incentives that just go think about cool stuff and invent cool stuff with a little bit of pushing that, hey, you need to publish stuff along the way.
Right.
So there needs to be some incentive, so you can't just sit around twiddling your thumbs.
Right.
And this is not unique to universities. A lot of private sector organizations do this effectively as well. Like
Right.
Google used to have it doesn't anymore, but used to have the 20% time, if you're familiar with that.
Mm-hmm.
They've unfortunately gotten rid of it, but Google really tried to do this historically really well. And now they've moved to a much more top-down model for what innovation is.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think Google's approach and the fact that they moved away from that is a form of innovation.
Yes.
They're innovating how they manage innovation.
100%, right? I certainly do not aim to be prescriptive on what the single best way of doing things is.
Yeah.
There are bad ways, but there's many, many good ways.
That's right. That's very well said. And I think your point about creating that environment within a company and that culture, so to speak, is critical. The GPS example is one that is near and dear to my heart because I think it's a perfect example, like you said, of why theoretical science is so critical and important. And also why we have to think about how we educate future innovators. Einstein, people think of as a mathematician, he was also a musician. He was a very well-rounded person. He thought about more than just science and was educated as more than just a scientist. And I think that's why he could manifest these thought experiments that led him to understand things like time moves differently here on the ground than it does up where a satellite is. And so if you're going to do GPS, you need to correct for the fact that time is not the same in those two places.
By the way, I think you're an engineer by training. So I don't know if you've ever heard of this. There was a famous argument between some U.S. Army general and some theoretical physicist arguing that they shouldn't adjust for those time differences. So
I had not heard of that.
So our modern GPS system would not have worked if that general had won that argument 30 or 40 years ago.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Because those microseconds make a huge difference between whether Google sends you to where you're trying to go, or Google Maps does, or it sends you into a swamp.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. Oh, wow. I'll have to track that down. That's a fascinating story. So this kind of focus on process versus outcome, especially as you were talking about that tenure funding model that exists in universities and the sort of 20% model that Google used to jumpstart and get themselves going in the early days of their innovation process journey, so to speak. Those both to me feel like ways to de-risk the environment, to sort of take the pressure to get to an outcome out of the system. Do you think that's core to how to set up a process, a way to manage or minimize risk exposure? Or do you think that's just...
I would frame it differently. Mm-hmm. It's not taking away the pressure to innovate. In fact, I believe there should be a little bit of incentives, whether that be tenure, whether that be money or something. I do want proactive incentives and pressure to innovate within the organization.
Sure.
Otherwise, a lot of people will ultimately get a little bit lazy.
That's right.
Myself included.
Yeah.
So rather than taking away the pressure, I would frame it differently. Mm-hmm. Take away the cost or risk of failure. Mm. So in too many organizations, if you fail, you are negatively penalized for it. So that discourages you from trying to do new things in the first place, right?
Right.
99% of new ideas are going to be inherently stupid and not work and not be better than the old ways because somebody already tried it that way and gave up on it.
Right.
So it's important to create a culture where failure towards innovation is acceptable and appreciated as a normal part of the innovative process, right? Most scientific innovations fail. Most novels fail, right?
Right.
But once in a while, you get the Harry Potters of the world.
Right. Exactly. I struggle sometimes with how to frame that within the concept of a process, because embracing failure, reducing the risk of failure, all those things, I think they're hard for human beings to wrap their heads around because failure feels bad. And so I've been thinking about how someone might reframe that. And I like the way that you talked about taking it out of the equation versus trying to make it good or bad or reframe failure itself, making it a natural part of the process.
There's a fun example I'd like to give. So I'm not sure if you're a basketball fan, but think of 3-point field goal percentages, right?
Yeah.
The best, most elite athletes in the world, the Steph Currys of the world, they're hitting 30, 40%. If you frame it another way, they're missing 60% of shots. These are the best in the world. And does anyone ever go to Steph Curry and say, you're terrible because you got 60% wrong? No, in fact, that's really, really good, right? He's one of the highest paid athletes in the world.
Right.
Especially in private sector organizations, that mentality is not taken. They look at only the negative side of things rather than think about, hey, you hit one basket the corporate equivalent of one invention out of the 100 that you try works, that's enough to make our year. That is enough to launch that new toy, that new technology, that new novel, whatever it is, right?
Right.
In fact, like publication houses for books actually do this really well. They know that 99% of the novels that they publish each year will go to zero, but then once in a while they find that Harry Potter or Twilight or whatever.
Exactly. And I think it's about framing success around the process that delivers Harry Potter versus the 100 outcomes. So it's more about, like you said, embracing the process, understanding that this process will deliver that 1 in 100 that delivers the return. But if you view it in this success failure on an outcome basis, on a book basis, you're going to get discouraged looking at the 99 books that have failed and will fail and should fail and are a natural part of the process of getting to the one. Mm-hmm. But it's the process that delivers the outcome and not the book.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay. So now I understand. I like that a lot because it's a way to take the word failure out of the equation because you don't have to talk about failure. You can just talk about the process. I wonder also about your definition brought up so many thoughts in my head. It also sparked the thought about horizons, time horizons. Whenever you talk about a process, the inherent question that pops in my head is, okay, well, what am I putting into the process and how long is it going to take? I know you're the leader of an innovation software company. How do you manage the thinking for folks around time horizon and the process?
Sure. So I think as with any decision in life, you have to start with what are the hard constraints. And those hard constraints may differ from one organization to another. Mm-hmm. They're at a university, they're constrained with an endowment. They're constrained, think, in hundreds of year time span.
Right.
As an individual tenure track professor, your time horizon may be 5 or 6 years because you need to get published.
Right.
If you're a venture-backed company, your time horizon is the 18 months that the venture capitalists gave you cash.
Right.
IdeaScale is in a fortunate situation where we are very profitable as a software company. So we can think, look, as a private sector company, I still have to generate profits from my shareholders, value for my customers and employees. So I can't say, hey, I'm only going to think about 10-year long bets. But at the same time, I'm in a very fortunate situation where I don't have to worry about this quarter, this month, this year. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's number one. Start with the hard constraints that are created by your organization or by the circumstances in which you live in, which, again, they exist, right? Let's not pretend that hard constraints don't exist. But once you're within that constrained environment, you want to find the optimal solution. So for me, I'm able to think 2 or 3 years out for our organization because that works within the framework or set of constraints that work for us. I have a certain amount of financial and people resource that I can allocate. But within that, we try to find whatever the best expected value outcome is, not specifically the single best home run or the safest way to hit a ball. You can always punt a ball, but rather what's the way to maximize the expected value of a set of experiments or outcomes within the constrained world that we live in.
Right. So, okay. So it's not about getting the right answer. It's more about seeking an optimized equilibrium within the set of constraints. Yeah.
Exactly. My process, we design a process that is designed to result in the best average outcome over time. Mm-hmm. Right? Whether that be a sales process, whether that be an engineering process, whether that be a product development process, we will encounter lots of failures. The good news is we've designed our process and none of those failures will take the company down. Right? They won't get any individual fired. They won't bankrupt the company.
Right.
Our home runs will be awesome. But on average, the outcome of whether it be our sales process, our engineering process, our product process, our promotion process, on average, those will consistently create value for everyone in our organization.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. And I think it's rare to talk about innovation processes in those terms because back to your original point within your definition, I think a lot of times people judge things by the outcome. And so the innovative thing is the thing that's most different or most disruptive, another term I have some trouble with. But talking about creating the best average outcome over time really does double down on that process thinking and not the we're trying to create lightning in a bottle here in a one-off sort of way. I think that's fantastic.
It's pretty much impossible. Like if you give 100 people, go create lightning in a bottle, probably all of them will fail, right?
Right.
Or one person will get lucky and succeed. It's like the coin flipping exercise. If a bunch of people flip heads and tails consistently, one person out of 1,000 will just happen to get 10 heads in a row.
Right.
purely due to luck.
Right.
But that's not a good process. Coin flipping is not a good process, right?
Right.
Instead,
Exactly.
you want to design a good process towards innovation, which again may differ from organization to organization, circumstance to circumstance.
Yes.
You just need the right set of environments, incentives, and tools at your disposal to enable that process to function effectively and repeatably.
Hmm. And I think that really also highlights and this is another bias of mine, we'll see what you think, but I think that case studies and benchmarking exercises within the world of innovation are extremely dangerous. I have my own way of talking about it, but I love you talking about the hard constraints within the organization. That really kind of makes it self-evident that you have to start by looking internally before thinking about, oh, well, this company did this, so we're going to do that. Where do you land on that topic?
So, look, running a private sector software organization, my customers are always asking for case studies of, hey, we are Microsoft. How did Google use you guys or do innovation?
Yep.
We obviously have to do that from a sales and marketing perspective. But conceptually, I think that's the wrong way of thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because, hey, what works for Google will not necessarily work for Microsoft. It's a fundamentally different organization. What works for NASA doesn't necessarily work for Blue Origin, the rocket company.
Sure.
Those are very different organizations with very different constraints, time horizons, funding models, types of people, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
So case studies, I think, are great from a sales and marketing perspective, but I think they're, in fact, the wrong way for an organization to long-term think about the sustainable, repeatable way that they should be doing innovation. That is going to truly be unique, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way I, as an individual, would do innovation is probably very different than you, because we are different people with different skills, interests, motivations in life, personalities, etc.
Exactly.
That's at an individual level, but that becomes even more compounded at an organizational level.
Exactly.
Corporations are very, very different entities.
Mm-hmm.
Just because Microsoft is a publicly listed company and Goldman Sachs is a publicly listed company doesn't make them at all similar.
Right. Exactly. And even to use a couple you just mentioned, just because you make the same things or compete in the same industry or operate at about the same market cap or size doesn't mean you operate the same way internally. You have the same internal sort of mechanisms, talent pool, culture, environment, all those things really can be very different paths to a similar outcome. And the reapplication is tricky across that. For me, it's about minimizing degrees of freedom. And I'm not going to go any deeper with that with a mathematician.
We could, certainly.
But I'm not gonna embarrass myself that way.
I love that frame. I haven't heard that in a long, long time, but I absolutely love
it. I just think there's so many more degrees of freedom outside of your company than there are inside of your company. If you're trying to get it right, you're going to have to take a lot more variables into account, so to speak, to translate a benchmark than you would to say, okay, well, how do we solve a complex nebulous problem last year? Why won't that work for us with this complex nebulous problem? Let's think about how we need to operate differently. Do we need a different approach, a different process, a different set of people? And building on that versus trying to say, okay, how did AWS do it or whomever? So I just really appreciate so many of the key elements of your definition. How do you think about what isn't innovation?
So I kind of alluded to this in the what is innovation, but innovation isn't an event. It's not we achieve this. It's not an invention. It's not a product. Those are byproducts of innovation. And getting it conflated is really, really bad for any organization. If I launched a new feature for my software system, that feature is not the innovation. That is a minuscule, candidly inconsequential part of our product, no matter how killer that feature is.
Right.
So that's a really important thing. Innovation is not the outcome, whether that be a new program you launch as a government, whether that be the new satellite that you send to Mars, whether that be the new chatbot you created.
Mm-hmm.
That's a product. That is an outcome. It's certainly valuable to be able to sell a new product.
Right.
But is that innovation? And more importantly, from an organization's long-term perspective, have you created a process to create the new product or not? Because a lot of companies, not just companies, organizations end up one-trick ponies.
Right.
Or, one-hit wonders in the music world.
Right. It's true. And it creates the illusion of control. Like this one-off success, you can tell yourself the story of how you created that one-off success, if you don't have an established conscious process. And that story you tell 99 times out of 100 is not going to be part of the actual path that got you to that success. And I think that's a lot of times, to your point, how people end up one-hit wonders is they misdiagnose what got them that hit.
Yeah, 100% agree.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of an example of how someone might mistake, I love that phrase, byproducts of innovation, how someone can protect themselves from mistaking a byproduct of innovation for innovation itself.
So there's mathematical ways to do it and there's qualitative ways. I'll start with the mathematical for a second. There's actually a really interesting field of mathematics and statistics which helps you separate luck from skill. And you can use it in very, very cool ways. For example, do you know which sport involves the most skill relative to luck in determining the outcome of which team wins?
Oh,
it's hockey.
Hockey.
So hockey is the sport that the outcome of who wins any given game is most determined by the sum total of the player's skill rather than by luck.
Wow. That would have been, at best, my third guess.
Amongst team sports. I'm not talking one-on-one, right?
Yeah, no, I figured that.
And you can do that at a company level, an organization level, if you have someone willing to step down. Well, number one, somebody has to care about what's skill versus luck. A lot of organizations just care about the fact, hey, we got a new product. Who cares how we came up with it?
Right.
So number one, somebody has to actually be willing to care about skill versus luck. And number two, somebody's got to do the analysis. At a more qualitative level, there's what I would call organizational ethics or ethos perspective. If your organization goal is to look, we created this one great product or one great service, we're going to get on CNBC or Wall Street Journal, get a lot of press and have a unicorn company, and we're happy with that, that's great. And you become famous, you become a billionaire, that's all fantastic. Now, if your goal is that, and that's sufficient, you've won, right? Who cares about whether you have an innovation process?
Right.
If your goal is, however, to build an organization that's going to continue to innovate and launch that next product and the next product, the next product, then you actually have to qualitatively ask yourself, have we developed a process that allows us to repeat and sustain?
Right.
So look at the world of technology. The modern example right now is Intel versus TSMC. Everyone has loved Intel for the last 40 or 50 years. TSMC, for the last 20 or 30 years, they've just been slowly grinding up the charts. And now they are just the dominant player. And no one really thought they were that awesome 20 years ago. I remember doing some work on semiconductors. People thought they were good,
right? But
no one appreciated, hey, these guys just consistently, every year they get a little bit better and they just never stop getting better. And that's terrifying when you roll the clock forward 30, 40 years.
Right. Yeah. That compounding effect of improvement.
Terrifying in a good way, by the way. TSMC, I have nothing but the highest respect for them, right?
Yes.
All of modern AI is enabled by them.
Right. No, yeah. The magnitude of the advancement can only, if it follows that path, can get pretty amazing very quickly over time, I'm sure. As I'm thinking about that element of luck versus skill, do you mean that in more sort of like the probabilistic, stochastic kind of way, or is that a different sort of luck versus skill?
So it would probably be similar, except a stochastic system assumes inherent randomness, and separating luck versus skill assumes that you can figure out the median or the mean or expected value that separates out the stochastic effects of a system.
Oh, wow.
So getting a little technical there.
No, that's cool. I'm curious about those sorts of things.
Again, you can do this for hockey and basketball and football, setting aside the mathematics, which again, you can hire somebody to do, you can look it up on Wikipedia. The math is actually not super complex.
Right.
Actually, you can ask ChatGPT to do it nowadays. But the importance is you can separate who got lucky and who actually has skill at an individual level, at an organization level, at a company level.
That is interesting. And that would require a very specific type of culture and environment and leadership ethos to actually want to know the answer to that question. Because to your point, you're either happy and satisfied with this one big outcome and don't want to ask the questions, or you want to ask the question, but you don't want the answer, if that makes sense.
The answer is sometimes tough.
Yeah.
Because at an individual level, what if somebody in hedge fund land, if somebody had a great year and made a ton of money for the company, but then your analysis reveals they just got lucky. They're not actually good at what they do. That person doesn't get that giant multi-million-dollar bonus that they expect.
Right.
By the way, there's some great organizations. There's Millennium Citadel, Point 72, that actually do a really good job of this at only rewarding people for skill in hedge fund investing.
Wow.
And that's why they are 20, 30, $40 billion institutions that have been around for 20, 30, 40 years.
Right.
Rather than a lot of hedge funds, which go up for a little while and then they implode spectacularly.
Right.
They were lucky coin flippers along the way.
Oh, wow. That is such an important distinction. I don't think I've had someone explain that and parse that out for me in quite that way. So thank you for that. So it's been an amazing conversation. I can't let you go without asking if you have any advice for innovators.
I would say three things. Number one, define the scope of life in where you want to innovate, whether that be music, art, science, money, whatever. Number two is figure out what the motivation for you to innovate is. To use a silly example, do you want to make money because you want to buy fancy things or just so you can brag about it on social media? Both are perfectly legitimate reasons that are unique to the individual. I don't particularly care about bragging on Instagram about anything. So, and then finally, try and develop a repeatable, consistent process that you can do as an individual or as an organization to achieve those intrinsic goals. Mm-hmm. And that could be silly examples. I want to be fit. So I got to wake up at my repeatable process. I wake up every morning at 6 and work out for 30 minutes, right? No matter how I feel.
Yeah.
At an organization level, it could be, look, if I want to develop new products, then I need a product team that every year, every month, every day, they are going out and developing a new product, and a bunch of those products will suck. And that's okay. But the moment you need that to have that process repeatably, rather than the classic example is 3M and Barbie, the Post-it notes and Barbie were invented by some random guy. That's great. These became multi-billion-dollar product lines.
Right.
But that's not the innovation process. That's getting lucky.
Right. Exactly. Oh, that's such great advice and context for people to go out into the world trying to create change in a process-driven way. It's so many great reminders and great perspective in there. Nick, it's been a fantastic conversation. I could pick your brain on this topic for hours and probably not get to the bottom of things. So thank you for your time. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Take care. Thanks so much for listening. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform to get more insights from innovators across the world. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel for additional content and conversation. I hope to see you there. Until next time, keep innovating, whatever that means.